Welcome to panel 3 of this CEPAD conference. It's going well so far. Very exciting sets of discussions this morning. I'm not so sure about the keynote speaker, but we'll get back on track now, I'm sure. So this panel is titled Protest Movements, Identity and Citizenship. And I'm delighted that we've got lots of interesting geographical, temporal, spatial, philosophical sets of papers from 4 wonderful participants. So we will go in the order that we have listed here, and I will introduce each presenter as they are to present. So I'll just quickly say we have Mohammed Shamak, Noor Koprulu, and I'm really sorry, Noor, I'm sure I've mispronounced your name and I feel really dreadful about that. Abbas Assi and Lillian Frost. So lots of exciting stuff to go on. We'll begin with Mohammed Shamak. Mohammed has a PhD from the University of Rouen in France. His research focuses on the interplay of culture and politics in the Maghreb. He's currently a lecturer at the University of Technology and Applied Sciences in Ibra, Oman. So, Mohammed, over to you, please. Mohammed, you're muted. As Ruba said, it's such a pandemic thing to say.
I'm really sorry about that. Good
okay.
Evening, everyone. Hi, Simon. And
Hi.
For me, I should say good evening. I think for you, it's good afternoon. So I should start right away. I know that I have just 15 minutes and I should make use of them. So I'll be dealing with citizenship in Tunisia, the change before and after the revolution. And yeah, I made a slight change to the title. I made it changes and challenges. So I want to start this talk by stressing the fact that the controversies on citizenship in Tunisia are one of the consequences of the Tunisian revolution. In fact, citizenship in Tunisia has hardly been discussed after the Tunisian independence in 1956. And the studies on citizenship in Tunisia and the Maghreb in general remain very few. And most studies tend to address citizenship in the Maghreb through an Orientalist approach. And here, through the perception of Tunisia and other Maghreb countries as part of the Arab identity and their belonging to the Middle East in general. I will start this talk with an analysis of the citizenship regime in Tunisia. In a second part, I'll deal with the emerging challenges after 2011, and I will end up with an attempt to answer the question on whether Tunisians are active citizens or not. So the citizenship regime in Tunisia, as established by the post-independence state, has been premised on a kind of a tacit pact between the citizen and the state. It's an agreement which sets the civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights of the citizens. This citizenship regime is a continuation of the citizenship and the French colonization. It started, as Roel Meyer put it, as a mark of discrimination on foreign privilege, and continued as a form of privilege for the indigenous elite, mainly the new Distur party members. This is a kind of an authoritarian bargain between the polity and the people. And under this citizenship regime, the state provides social services like education, healthcare, pensions, etc., in exchange for a very reduced level of civil and political rights. And this is in fact the case with most of the post-colonial regimes in the Maghreb. So the political power rested with the state, embodied by President Habib Bourguiba, the first Tunisian president after independence till Ben Ali's coup in 1987. Bourguiba came to represent the state and Ashab, the people, as is the case with President Qais Said these days. Another major aspect of this citizenship regime is President Bourguiba's conception of the Tunisian state as a homogenizing and homogeneous state. It's in fact an idealized conception of Tunisia. This citizenship regime is commonly referred to as Tunisianité and continued in Tunisia until 2011. And this leads me into the second part of this talk. And here I'll deal with the end of the pact and the call for a new citizenship regime. In 2011, people rose against Ben Ali, and in fact, they wanted to challenge the old citizenship regime. This was mostly the result of the erosion of the social role of the state in the provision of the social services, mainly as a consequence of the neoliberal reforms. And here, this was the first breach of that pact that existed between the citizens and the state. In fact, the neoliberal reforms led to the impoverishment of Tunisians. They increased employment, they led to lower wages, etc. According to Fadel Kaboub, neoliberalism in Tunisia led to rampant corruption, increased inequality, and social and economic exclusion. At the same time, it built a multi-billion-dollar business empire for the elite class, mainly those connected to the Ben Ali family. In brief, the first change of the regime of citizenship in Tunisia was the result of neoliberalism. This change was marked with the relinquishing of the social role of the state. Therefore, the protests against Ben Ali in 2008 and in 2011 could be considered as calls for a new pact between the state and the citizens. Most protests against Ben Ali, mainly in the mining basin in 2008, called for jobs, freedom, and national dignity, and the same applied to the 2011 protests. And the continuous stress on dignity during these protests shows a longing for a redefinition of the Tunisian citizenship regime, which conceives of Tunisians as full citizens. There was a clear stress on the need to redefine the civil, social, and political rights. However, dignity during these protests went beyond the civil to include the political. And here there was a call for political participation. In fact, these protests show that the controversy and the struggle for citizenship in Tunisia has remained relevant to Tunisian politics. And in fact, till now, meaning citizenship is empowering, the notion of Tunisian citizenship is empowering the subjects to ask for their rights, meaning the citizens. I don't want to use the expression subjects here. Nevertheless, it is transforming. And here I'm quoting Izine and Niers, who state in this context that the Tunisian citizens are changing and that they are going from the static recipient to the dynamic claimant, and therefore from being passive subjects to active citizens. However, to better understand the crisis of citizenship in Tunisia under Ben Ali, we need to look into the vocabulary of the protesters. Actually, even after the departure, meaning after the fall of the Ben Ali regime, the vocabulary was almost the same. So the protesters challenged the state as a band of thieves. And here the slogan was "تشغيل استحقاقي عصابة السراق," meaning employment is a right, band of thieves. The same slogan changed later into "تشغيل استحقاق لا خلافة لا نفاق," meaning employment is a right, no khilafa, no hypocrisy. And this was under Nahda rule, meaning the Islamist party, which was in power in Tunisia from 2011 to 2021, actually, till July the 25th. It's interesting that protesters mixed in these demands their rights, mainly the social rights, jobs, and welfare, with demands challenging the political community, describing them as thieves and hypocrites. Commenting on the vocabulary of the protesters, Sami Zimni stated in this context that the protesters were not solely referring to the failing labor market and high employment. They were also voicing a demand for inclusion, well-being, protection, and especially political participation. And this is the case with the ethnic and religious minority in Tunisia. And this leads me into the last part of this talk. Actually, despite the fact that protests against the Ben Ali regime have shown that Tunisians were united in their demands to put an end to dictatorship, the post-Ben Ali era saw the emergence of what Stéphanie Poussel referred to as les marges renaissantes, or the re-emerging margins, which challenged the monolithic environment in Tunisia. Foussel contends that the Tunisian minorities, mainly Amazigh, blacks, and Jews, started to pressure for ethnic and religious plurality in a country which has been built on the notion of Tunisianity as advocated by President Bourguiba. Now, this conception of Tunisianity or the Tunisian citizenship has quashed all other voices, regardless of the color of the citizen, their religion, or their ethnicity, or even their social class. So this ideology, meaning it's also an ideology, managed to unite Tunisians regardless of their color, religion, or ethnicity. However, after the Tunisian revolution, this unity was challenged on the grounds that it transgressed the rights of minorities. This controversy, in fact, on the rights of minorities was concomitant with the debate on citizenship in the country at large, on how to define the Tunisian citizen after 2011. This controversy ramified in the Tunisian media with frequent debates on the Tunisian identity. On the one hand, we have the self-proclaimed Bourguibis, meaning followers of the ex-president Habib Bourguiba. These are the self-proclaimed Democrats, or they call themselves Hadafis, modernists, and they were calling for the continuation and the strengthening of the Bourguiba legacy, especially as far as women's rights and the secularization of the state are concerned. On the other hand, we have the self-proclaimed revolutionaries, Thawriyin, who call for a new identity of the Tunisian people that considers, and these Thawriyin consider Bourguiba's Tunisianity as a top-down autocratic kind of citizenship that made Tunisians passive citizens. At the same time, the second camp here, the Thawriyin, they call themselves so, they think that Bourguiba has obliterated the identity of the Tunisian people. And it's interesting that in this controversy, religion was the focus. So on the one hand, we have the Bourguibis demanding the continuation of the secularization of the state. The second group, or the second camp, demanded the consideration of Islam as a main aspect of the Tunisian identity. And hence, the need to, they think that Tunisian people are part of the Arab Muslim world, and therefore Islam and that Arab identity should be extended to the Tunisian people, meaning Tunisian people they think that Tunisian people are Muslims and that they are Arabs, unlike the other camp, which the modernists who think that we should continue with the legacy or the vision of Bourguiba of the Tunisian people as modern people, as a secular state, etc. So both camps used the expressions to deride one another. So on the one hand, the Hadafis referred to the second camp as Raj'in, Dalamin, meaning backward people, and constantly used the expression like they don't look like us, meaning they are not Tunisians. The latter, meaning the second camp, and here we have Thawriyin, referred to the second camp as Jama'at al-Namat, meaning the Tunisian lifestyle, and Hadathut, meaning, and it's here, the use here of the modern, of the word Hadafiyin, meaning modernist in a pejorative way, and Thaqafut, etc. This polarization remains a serious threat to the future of the country, as there is no consensus on what defines or what constitutes the Tunisian citizen. And unfortunately, this escalated into violence in many times and assassinations, as was the case with Shukri Belaid, as was the case with the assassination of Shukri Belaid. This polarization was a main aspect of the controversy on citizenship in Tunisia. It represents a major turn in Tunisian history, with the shift of the controversy from the civil and the social, from what is civil, political, and social, to a controversy on identity. And unfortunately, this bifurcation continues to divide Tunisian society. And this leads us into the last point here, which is a bit different, meaning, and has to do with, it's a kind of an appraisal of the Tunisian people and whether they have been active citizens or good citizens or no. Now, first, let me start this part by saying that whenever the Tunisian state breaches the Citizenship Pact, Tunisians protested. Even under Bourguiba and especially when the government decided to lift the subsidies on basic commodities, Tunisians protested, and this was mainly known as the bread riots in December 1983, in which more than 100 people died. The same thing happened under Ben Ali, and the regions like Gafsa and the mining basin in general remained as the hotbed of rebellion, meaning under Ben Ali and Bourguiba. So, but what is striking, low?
We can hear you, Mohammed. Yes.
Okay, great. I thought that there was a network issue. So what is striking in protests, however, under Ben Ali is that protesters questioned the importance of the citizenship regime, and they voiced their anger through slogans which asked the government to honor its pact. Otherwise, for example, in many cases, they called for another citizenship, meaning, and here we, in the legal sense of the term. For example, in Bingardan, a border region with Libya, protesters in many times use slogans like Ya Ben Ali al Habina wal al Qaddafi awla bina, meaning either you take care of us, otherwise we'll join Qaddafi, meaning Libya at that time. And the same applied to protesters from Gasri in central West Tunisia, where they sought in protest moves to enter the Algerian territory in protest against the failure of the state to establish justice and equality. So, despite the fact that Tunisians were for more than 50 years under authoritarian regimes, yet whenever the state fails in honoring that citizenship pact, they protested, especially in regions like the mining basin and the far south. So it seems possible to say that Tunisians were not passive citizens, but to a certain extent, they were active, especially, as I said earlier, in region. Shall I conclude? Okay, I'll conclude. In brief, it seems possible to say that Tunisians are not passive citizens, and this has been confirmed in recent anti-Said protests as Tunisians continue to pressure for political participation after President Qais Said's decision to suspend parliament on July the 25th, 2021. However, the major challenge these days is the inflow of many migrants to Tunisia seeking to reach the other side of the Mediterranean, especially with the EU use of Tunisia as a rampart against African migrants. In fact, through the condition of the immigrant in Tunisia, and especially in Europe, it seems sound to say that citizenship remains a source of exclusion rather than inclusion. And if citizens are benefiting from the status of the citizen, others are suffering. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mohammed. That was fascinating, provocative, and a great deal to reflect on. So I look forward to the Q&A and picking up on some of these themes. So thank you so much. A couple of bits of housekeeping that I should just remind people of. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Presenters, I'll send you a message in the chat when you are approaching 15 minutes and then wave to you when you've gone over 18 minutes, okay? But that was wonderful, Mohammed. Thank you so much. So next, we are delighted to welcome Noor Koprulu, and I hope I got it slightly closer that time, Noor.
Yes,
Noor is professor and the head of the Department of Political Science at the Near East University. She did her PhD degree in International Relations at MITU in Ankara, Turkey. She's published articles and book chapters on processes of democratization, politics of identity and opposition in the Middle East, as well as the impact of the Arab uprisings on selected countries. She currently studies and focuses on processes of democratization and authoritarian resilience in the cases of Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco after the 2011 Arab uprisings and the Syrian refugees hosted both in Jordan and Lebanon. So we're very much looking forward to this. Noor, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, Elias. And thank you very much for all the panelists. And it seems like that, I mean, we will be having very interesting and stimulating discussions today and tomorrow. So I will be talking about the shifting identities and the issue of citizenship in Jordan, and how, in a talking about a little bit about history, then I will try my best to focus on, in the post-Arab uprisings era, how the debates on citizenship and identity started to change, at least within the case of Jordan. I will not going to go into so much detail about, for instance, passports or other related issues, because I can see that Lillian Frost will also going to focus on that. So I will be, first of all, I would like to first of all start that when we talk about Jordan, one of the most important topic that really attracted international scholarship when they study Jordan, it is the politics of identity. The state and nation building process in this country has not been very easy, and it has been always precarious. This is something directly related with the Palestine-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the River Jordan has always been considered as the principal indication of bordering the country, particularly with King Hussein's decision when he announced that the Kingdom of Jordan will disassociate all its ties, will sever all its ties with the West Bank. It was a very important moment in rebordering and also in remaking the nation state in the country. So when we look into the demographics of the country, we can see that there is something really ironic, but as Gudrun Kremer also stated, that nevertheless, despite the fact that Jordan is one of those artificial entities ever established in the post-First World War era as an emirate, it has been one of the most, interesting case in terms of showing the regime durability, and it has been even the most stable countries in the region. Of course, when we, just in parentheses, need to add the Civil War, 1970 and 1971. Being as this corridor state between the soon-to-be-created state of Israel in 48 and onwards, between Israel and the Arab world, Jordan has always been very much affected by the unsettlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I can definitely say that the Arab-Israeli conflict have definitely affected the Palestinians and the Israelis, but it also affected Jordan and as well as the citizenship policies in the country. So this actually led us to talk about, yes, there are minority groups in the country, Circassians, we should not forget Chechens and the Christians, but there is one of the biggest issues that marks Jordanian identity and citizenship policies is definitely the influx of Palestinians across Jordanian borders with the first Arab-Israeli war and after the third Arab-Israeli war, 67 war. And Jordan has been the only Arab country granting the Palestinian citizenship, which dates back to Abdullah I's decision when they annexed West Bank and East Jerusalem. However, accommodating Palestinian Jordanians and Jordanian Jordanians, or how we can call East Bankers and the West Bankers on one land, sometimes some scholars call this process as two people on one land. I think I use this connotation as well. It was very time to time challenging the country's identity politics. Nevertheless, as Lurie Brand very systematically explained when he wrote her article in 1994, the monarchy wanted to acquire the legitimacy through using Islam coming from the descendants of Prophet Muhammad, and at the same time considering Palestinian Jordanians and Jordanian Jordanians as forming one, coming from same family or familial bonds, and of course having commitment to Palestine. This time to time did not actually solve all the problems in the country in terms of integrating the Palestinians into Jordanian political landscape. So we can definitely talk about that there is Palestinian Jordanian cleavage in the country, which has become so apparent after 1971, when PLO was actually need to, leave the country. And as you know, Simon, you are an expert on Lebanon. Then we have the PLO, moving to Lebanon and becoming another maybe reason for another civil war in the case of Lebanon. So because of this policy of controlled integration of the Palestinians, with the democratization, when started in 1989 in Jordan, which was a very important date right after the disengagement from West Bank, the year after, with the change in the electoral law, the kingdom wanted to actually embrace, those Palestinian Jordanians who are not living on West Bank, but now, considering living on Jordan, was not still very easy, because Jordan has always felt the threat not to become al-Watan al-Badil, which refers to be an alternative homeland for the Palestinians. And this led Jordan to posit its policy of citizenship. In other words, the policy of citizenship is demarcated in this country through different politics of identity. Before the civil war, it was considering the Palestinians and the Jordanians coming from the same familial bonds. But after the civil war, then we have East Bank first trend. Then after particularly the ascendancy of King Abdullah II, we have seen 2002 onwards, Jordan first, which is Al-Urdun Awalan, which also led us to think about that the kingdom's policy is actually trying to include those Jordanians. But who is a Jordanian is also another question mark. The Jordanian, or the prominent Jordanian is started to be discussed with the ascendancy of King Abdullah II, which also showed us to see that after his father, he also wanted to have a new support base, which is going to be definitely based on East Bankers. So is Jordan Palestine? Palestine is Jordan. All these debates is still actually affecting the country's citizenship and also identity politics. No need to mention what has happened with the deal of the century of the former president of the United States of America. And the democratization process in this country has always been demarcated by this, with this question mark. And this led the regime to negotiate on anything but with the red line. And the red line has been this electoral law. Who is going to actually represent the Jordanians in the legislature. Within this perspective, of course, we can also talk about the Palestinians and how they are also categorized right after the disengagement from the West Bank. But I would like to put the emphasis on what has happened with the 2011 and onwards due to my time limitation. The people with the 2011 in Jordan, with the Day of Anger, particularly starting, with the 2011 January and also in March, the country has experienced with large scale protests. And the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim brothers, they were the latecomers. Although the Jordanian history is very much reputed for having cordial ties and non-confrontational relationship with the kingdom, but the larger scale protests actually is characterized by cross-cutting, let's say, coalitions we have seen in the streets. And we also started to see that there is an active citizenship demand by the people. This is, I guess, something that Mohammed also wanted to raise in his presentation. Plus, we have approximately 1 million Syrian refugees. UNHCR number is a little bit, let's say, below than 1 million, but in accordance with the unofficial records or by the statements of the kingdom's officials, we have also Syrian refugees, plus the Iraqi refugees, plus the Palestinian refugees. There is actually a diverse population right now in Jordan. So to actually think about the let's say 50s or the citizenship policy that dates back to 1950s or 60s is actually a very, very problematic in the country right now. So what has been brought by the protests? People ask for the ending of the corruption. People, especially with the 2018 June protests, sometimes we call it as Jordan's second spring, and the June 2018 protests were actually more threatening the regime than the others, than the earlier ones in 2011, because with the 2011, we started to think about that the kingdom is resilient in dealing with the protests and the opposition. But with the 2018, we have seen that no, actually the kingdom is really, really facing with a big challenge. And here today, it has also some roots since 2000 and onwards. But now the main threat to the monarchy or the main opposition is either not the Ikhwan or the Palestinians, but the East Bankers and the Hirak movement, which led us to think about that we have more active citizenship, and people are now trying to talk about the new area of the political. So there is a decline in the trust in the parliament. There is a very big decline in the trust in the political parties, and there is a decline in the trust in the elections. When you also see the turnout results after the elections lately in 2020, it is very low. And in accordance with the World Value Survey, I mean, people trust in parliament is decreasing day by day. Well, actually, this is not something peculiar to Jordan, I have to say. When I also check some statistics, we can also definitely see that, including Tunisia. Even Tunisia has been seen one of the, I mean, the most promising case in terms of democratic transition in the region. Still, trust in the parliament is getting low. So what about the future of the political reform in the country, and what we can talk about rethinking about the conceptualization of citizenship and who is a Jordanian or who is a prominent Jordanian. People now is also talking about the division in terms of basically social economic rights, and thinking about electoral law or revising the political parties law is something now at the lower, on their agenda at the lower level, but rather, as Sarah Ababneh very rightly pointed out, that the new area of the political is actually the social economic reforms. So people, they're aware of the fact that the newly established, for instance, the committee under Sami al-Rifai, who was the former prime minister when we had the Arab Spring in Jordan. He was the first actually prime minister that was dismissed and was replaced by Maruf al-Bakhit. But now he was assigned as the head of the royal committee, which is going to be responsible for the political reform. But the people are actually asking employment. People are asking the end of socio-economic disparities. They're asking for, first of all, employment and end of corruption. So all of these debates let us to think about that all these protests in the country, and I think this is something that representing the whole MENA region to a great extent, the old political institutions started to lose their credibility and trust. And this is the reason that the protests has become the new arena of the new politics. But to what extent this new area of politics would let these people to ask for genuine rights, particularly economic and social rights, we will definitely will see. But we should not underestimate the fact that with this Arab Spring, something started to change. Nevertheless, we don't have a real, let's say, revolution yet, but there is a change in the state-society relations, and we should also, will probably see the new discussions on the citizenship, how we could define citizenship. Because most Middle Eastern constitutions, as Suad Joseph also stated, articulate notions of individualized citizens. You are either a part of a family or a religion or an ethnic or a tribal group. But now people all are actually from different, let's say, segments of the society. They ask for the same thing, and they are asking their rights, which would actually let them to maybe to think about that. The state thinks them that they are individualized citizens, but they also are trying to create a social cohesion. Maybe this social cohesion would also bring a political cohesion. But what is also the challenge in front of the East Bank opposition, the Hirak movement in Jordan, is also the division among the East Bankers regarding actually this issue of, political cohesion, as I just wanted to mention. So the genuine reforms, a real genuine reform package, I think can, save the country from the further protests. And this reform package would definitely also embrace economic rights and social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noor. That was really, really interesting. And that shift from collective to individual and individual to collective rights is fascinating. And it speaks to the debate and discussion we've had about ways of trying to reevaluate communal difference and sectarian difference within the context of the rule of law. So I look forward to picking up on some of these discussions in the Q&A. So thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Abbas Assi. Abbas is a lecturer and the author of a wonderful book on Lebanon. I am getting the title here. He's the author of Democracy in Lebanon, Political Parties and the Struggle for Power Since the Syrian Withdrawal, published by IB Tauris in 2016, with a paperback version coming 3 years later. He holds a PhD from the University of Leeds. And I think the last time I saw Abbas was about 10 years ago in Leeds. So Abbas, it's nice to see you. I'm very much looking forward to your talk today. So you have 15 minutes. I'll send you a chat when you hit that time, and then do a little wave at you if you go too much over. So Abbas, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for organizing this event. Nice to see you after 10 years. Since the days of University of Leeds. My discussion today is about the protest movements in Lebanon and Iraq. I will talk as someone who is following the politics of those two countries and someone who participated in the protest during October 2019 in Lebanon. My discussion will focus on the factors that impeded the ability of those two protest movements to achieve their objectives, and the ability of the protesters to exert pressure on the political elites and political class and sectarian parties to initiate reforms and obtain their objectives. I'll focus on the three main factors. There are many other factors, but in my discussion today, I'll focus on the three main factors: transitional justice, external environment and its impact on the ability of those two protest movements to achieve their objectives, and the absence of leadership and its importance for the success of those two protest movements. The notion about transitional justice, and I think Eric talked about it a little bit in Iraq, that the issue of reconciliation and its importance for the success of the formation of state in Iraq. I think there are two main events that shaped the recent history of Iraq, which were not followed by a transitional justice process. The fall of the regime in 2003 and its implications, and the ISIS invasion in 2014. The fall of the regime actually was supposed to be followed by a transitional justice process to solve the implications of the policies that were followed and adopted by the former regime, and the massacres that were committed by the former regime, and those who did these massacres was supposed to be prosecuted and brought to justice. Also, the families that suffered from the former regime policies and aggressive policies were supposed to be compensated. The second implication was the Sunni behavior after 2003, and that's actually one of the most important issues to bring the sectarian communities in Iraq together. After the fall of the regime, the Sunni Iraqis felt more intimidated and marginalized. And that's because the coalition that dominated the politics and the state institutions and the parliament and the government after 2003 was a coalition formed mainly from shared groups and supported and funded by the United States. This actually created a sense of marginalization, entrenched the sense of fear among the Sunnis. And that's one of the factors can be used also to discuss and analyze why the Al-Qaeda was able to flourish and mushroom in Sunni-dominated areas in Iraq after 2003, and that's also can be related to the sense of marginalization among the Sunnis that pushed them to support implicitly probably a large portion of them to support implicitly the invasion of ISIS in 2014, and that sped also the sectarian violence that erupted between 2006 and 2008 in Iraq. The second issue is the second milestone in the history is the invasion of ISIS in 2014 and its implications. Although the invasion of ISIS was actually able to bring all the Iraqis together and entrench this sense of national identity among the Iraqis, because they were able to defeat ISIS and force it to leave. They were able to liberate the Mosul and Nineveh provinces, but all this actually has another negative side, because this fed the sense of marginalization also among the Sunnis, because the Sunnis felt that they were responsible for what happened, because the ISIS was able to find some grassroots support among the Sunnis, and they were accused of being supporting terrorism, and that's let also increase their sense of marginalization and fear and entrenched the mutual distrust between the sectarian communities. And that's all actually explain why the Sunnis didn't protest in large numbers like the Shiites in southern provinces in 2019 when the protests erupted against the dominant political parties and against the political class in Iraq. This sense of marginalization, this sense of being accused of terrorism and supporting ISIS, and before 2014 was accused of supporting the return of the Ba'ath regime, also can be justified and explained by the de-Ba'athification process that was adopted by the dominant coalition and led to the marginalization of a large portion of the Sunnis from the state bureaucracy and state institutions. All this actually entrenched this natural distrust between the sectarian communities in Iraq. And that's why it's very important to adopt a transitional justice process to solve these implications and to bring the communities together and bring mutual trust and bridge the gap between the sectarian communities in Iraq. In Lebanon, actually, the situation is a bit different. In Lebanon, we have a civil war that ended in 1990, but we are still suffering from its implications until today. The leaders of the militias that committed the crimes during the civil war and committed massacres against the Lebanese are still dominating the political life in Lebanon, and they are still using the same sectarian language that they used during the civil war to mobilize followers and to build a coherent popular support among within their sectarian communities. And that's because after the end of the civil war, Lebanon didn't have a transitional justice process to solve the implications of the war. Those who committed the crimes were not persecuted. Those who were displaced and left forced to leave their villages and cities were not able to return back until today. Large portion of them didn't return back until today because of the corruption in the state bureaucracy, and the parties that took the Ministry of Displacement tried to direct the funding and the financial resources of the government to fund their communities, and while excluding other communities, especially in Druze and Maronite and Christian areas, because these areas are mixed, and many, for instance, Christian families were forced to leave Druze-dominated villages and cities, and this actually didn't happen. In 2019 protest, this debate emerged once again, and all the parties viewed the protest movement from their own angles. For instance, the Lebanese Forces Party asked its followers to participate heavily in the protest, not because they wanted to reform the state institutions, but they raised the fears of their followers that Hezbollah, especially during the first few days and few weeks, the Shiites were heavily participating in the protest, and they raised the fears of their followers that we want to direct the protest against Hezbollah armed wing, the resistance, and it's an opportunity also to topple and force Bashar al-Assad, the head of the president, who is the main competitor within the Sunni community for the Lebanese Forces Party and its leader Samir Jaja. So the Lebanese Forces Party asked its followers to participate and block the roads. Aoun raised the fears of the Christians that the protest movement eventually is asking to remove sectarianism, and that stands against the interests of the Christians. So I ask you not to participate, or at least try to direct the protest against the policies that were adopted by the Rafiq Hariri and Saad Hariri and the Future Movement Party in Lebanon. So Hezbollah also raised its views about the eventual direction of the protest movement. The leader of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, warned its supporters that there are attempts from external players and domestic players to pit the protesters against the supporters of Hezbollah and the resistance, and that will lead to sectarian violence, and asked his followers to leave the squares in Beirut and in southern Lebanon and not to participate in these protests because of the fear of violence. This debate emerges in Lebanon in every event that takes place in Lebanon, especially in events like these, which are in Lebanon in October 2019. We witnessed a very large cross-sectarian protest, and it was the first attempt, a bottom-up approach or a bottom-up attempt to build a state and to ask to reform the state institutions, and it was the first large cross-sectarian protest to be organized outside the sphere of influence of the sectarian political parties. In 2005, we had these protests, large protests, and included Sunni Shiites and Christians and Jews, but they were organized by sectarian parties and existing dominant parties. But in 2019, these parties were not the main organizers of these protests. So they tried to divert protests and direct it toward achieving their own ends. The second factor is the external environment and its impact on the protest movement in both countries. I think in Iraq, there was a competition between the United States and Iran to manipulate the protests. Iran accused the United States of trying to fund and support the protest movement in Iraq to expel the Iranian influence, or to force the dominant political parties and the governing coalition to resign. And this coalition was actually a close ally to Iran. The United States expressed its support to the protest movement. For instance, Pompeo said that the Iraqis and Lebanese have the right to get to Iran's meddling. Also, the position of Jeffrey Feltman, the former U.S. ambassador in Lebanon, expressed his support to the protest movement and considered it as part of the strategy of the United States to dismantle the social support of Hezbollah in Lebanon. These foreign competition over the protest movement and their attempts to divert it and direct it toward their ends actually had impact on the credibility of the protest movement. And this raised actually questions among the protesters about the eventual goal of this protest movement, whether is it a political goal to achieve the interests of certain players, or actually it's aimed to achieve the interests of the protesters by reforming the state institutions and reforming the electoral law, reforming the socio-economic policies of the government. Also, another important event that had implications on the protest movements in Lebanon is the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes. This actually had impact on the protest movement in Iraq. Muqtada Sadr was heavily participating in the protest and was trying to manipulate the protest movement to achieve his political objectives, asked the protesters to take a position against the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, but the protest movement rejected, and then he asked his followers to leave the squares, and this later led to clashes between the protesters and the Sadr supporters. In Lebanon, actually, this also raised the fears of the protesters about the implications of these external and major events, especially in Qasem Soleimani. Before his death, in 1 day or 2 days, he met Nasrallah in Lebanon and left Lebanon to Syria, and from Syria to Iraq. And in Iraq, when he arrived, he was assassinated. So it was the message. That's what was understood by the Shia community who was participating in the protest. That this was a message from the United States to Hezbollah and the opponents of the United States in Lebanon. So all these events actually had impact on external events, had impact on the credibility and the ability of the protest movement to achieve its objectives. Even within the protest movement, there were accusations from the lefty groups. They accused the right-wing groups of being funded from the United States. Actually, when I was in the protest, I used to go almost every day to the protest, to the Shahada in Beirut. I can differentiate between the leftist groups and the right-wing groups. For instance, one of the parties that emerged a few years ago, Sab'a Movement 7, it's called 7 Party, had a large, it's widely funded, heavily funded. I don't know the sources of its funding, but this raised actually the fees and the questions among the protesters about this nascent and small party, how it get funded, and has this a huge financial support from where. That's most likely probably from external players. This actually, the Sab'a party tried to have a large stadium in Saht al-Shahada and tried to organize events and to attract followers and to attract protesters to participate in the events that the party organized. That's briefly the impact of external environment. The last factor is the absence of leadership. I think that's the most important. It's very essential to have a leadership. The protest movements justified this by stating that we lack agreement on political and economic policies. They were afraid of being co-opted by the sectarian parties. Also, they lacked experience, and this raised their fears about their ability to lead these large protests. I met one of them, Hassan Bazzi, he's a lawyer. I met him and discussed the 2015 protests in Lebanon, and he told me that the large protests that we organized in August 28 in 2015 was really very large. Was expected about 50,000, and he said that it was about 100,000 according to him. And that's raised our fees as organizers of these events because we don't have the organization skills and capabilities to organize these large events. This actually, the absence of leadership had impact on the protest movement to formulate clear political and socio-economic policies, allowed political parties to interfere. In Lebanon, the sectarian parties interfered and blocked the roads under the name of the protesters to send messages to their opponents. In Iraq, also the Southern movement interfered in the protest movement and considered itself as the main player and the main party that participated and the largest party that participated in the protest movement. So he has the right to speak in the name of the protesters because Muqtada Sadr and his movement has the right to speak in the name of the protesters and ask a chef on the government and all. The last point is they resisted negotiating with the government. I think that was a mistake, in my opinion, because the government was actually elected, democratically elected by the Lebanese and the Iraqis, and the protesters, they don't have the constitutional right to ask them to resign. And I think they should have done is that they should negotiate with the government to achieve gradual and piecemeal steps toward reform steps. And at the same time, they should keep protesting in the streets to exert pressure on the governing coalitions to formulate and reform the state institutions, because you can't ask them to eliminate confessionalism in just one step without convincing the protesters that that we are credible. Also, you have to raise reasonable and realistic objectives. Eliminate confessionalism process in Lebanon that will raise the fees of the Christians. The protest movement is supposed to raise small objectives, step-by-step approach. For instance, they can raise issues like reforming the electricity sectors. In Lebanon and Iraq, they have major problems with this issue. Regarding these issues, reforming the socio-economic policies, reforming the security fund in Lebanon. These steps, these small steps that will build the trust, build experience, and encourage the protesters to participate in large numbers in the protest movements. I'll stop here. That's it. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Abbas. Really, really interesting stuff, as expected. It's a pleasure hearing you you speak. Now, last but by no means least, we have Lillian Frost, who's got a paper titled Citizenship Spectrums, Misalignments of Nationality, Passports and Belonging in Jordan. Lillian is, I believe, oh goodness, recently a Max Weber Fellow at the EUI. I've got a feeling that you've just moved on though, Lillian. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, there was some overlap, but I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech.
That's right. Yes, I knew you were coming from the States, and then for some reason I had the EUI stuck in my mind. But either way, you're doing amazing work on questions of citizenship, and I'm absolutely delighted that you are with us today. So, Lillian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, great. And I'm not muted. Okay, great. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm excited to be here and excited to have some discussions on citizenship and on Jordan. So I'm thrilled that Noor is also presenting on Jordan, gave some background and context to my paper. So this presentation focuses on misalignments of nationality, passports, and belonging. The messiness and ambiguity surrounding these different dimensions of citizenship among different groups in Jordan is what inspired this work, and my interest in breaking down precisely what citizenship means and how it materializes in context, especially those with protracted refugee groups, which is basically referring to contexts where refugees coming from the same territory have been in a host state for at least 5 years without immediate prospects for fully integrating in or leaving that host state. And as we know, the Palestinians have been in Jordan for far longer than 5 years. So in Jordan, many cases of extremely protracted refugee groups. So these kinds of contexts raise numerous questions, including how do host states incorporate protracted refugee groups? How do they navigate the contradictions of these long-term or even effectively permanent temporary statuses? And what does citizenship look like for these groups? And this paper examines these questions through a careful analysis of Jordan's responses to its Gazan refugees over time. And the Gazans are Palestinian refugees who fled from the Gaza Strip after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War to Jordan's East Bank. Most Gazans are double refugees, though, so important to point out that most of these refugees had fled to the Gaza Strip from what became the State of Israel during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, before then fleeing again after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, being kind of forced out to Jordan. The Gazans reveal how host states can create spectrums of citizenship for protracted refugees by distinguishing between possessing nationality and carrying passports from that state. And these traits in some ways make them a deviant case regarding much of the existing kind of broader, not necessarily focused on the Middle East and North Africa scholarship in this subfield, which tends to treat the terms citizenship and nationality as interchangeable synonyms. So this is a photo looking out from Jarash camp in Jordan, which is the main camp where Gazan refugees were settled and where many still live. The Gazans in Jordan are an excellent case to unpack the nuances between citizenship, nationality, passports, and belonging, because these differences particularly are apparent for them. And I think this is due in part to the political acceptability in Jordan and broadly in the region of the temporary treatment of Palestinian refugees because of this sustained absence of a Palestinian state. I think it's also due in part to the Gazans being in Jordan alongside Palestinians who, by arriving after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, have Jordanian nationality. So they're particularly unique in that regard, as Noor pointed out. This is one of the only groups of Palestinians in Jordan, at least before the disengagement, that did not have access to Jordanian nationality, to that legal citizen status. I think this kind of makes them a bit of a more puzzling case and an interesting one to explore. So as a brief summary, this paper finds that by examining Jordan's policies toward the Gazan refugees over time, states can disaggregate passport, nationality, and citizenship categories to enact or to create ambiguous citizenship statuses that can increase the state's flexibility in responding to refugee crises, particularly as they remain ongoing for decades, which means that refugees can end up occupying these temporary membership statuses for generations. In addition, as I've already been alluding to and building up to, this paper argues that such instances of disaggregated citizenship, nationality, and passports highlight how problematic it is to use these terms interchangeably. This terminological imprecision masks important empirical variation, where groups may lack access to legal citizen status, to nationality, but have access to passports and other citizen-like rights, such as to public education, healthcare, and work. And I'm not saying that this is only the case for Gazan refugees in Jordan, but I think we can find other cases in the region and globally as well of these in-between statuses. And I argue it also obscures the forms of membership and belonging held by groups who lack nationality, but have lived in a host state for generations or for all of their lives. And that these variations are important for accurately identifying the treatment of refugee groups in host states, as well as indicating the specific areas in which refugees might need more protection. And overall, these variations help to deepen and advance understandings of really who counts as a citizen and member of the national community. Okay, so that's sort of the snapshot of the paper. So it's important, of course, to spell out a bit more clearly how I'm using these different terms. So citizenship, I'm treating it as the set of statuses, rights, duties, and connections in law and practice between a state and its resident group. So I'm really focusing on that connection to the state. And nationality as just one dimension of citizenship that represents the bare bones legal citizen status and the documents that prove this status. While passports are a legal document that connect an individual to a political entity that is responsible for that individual, and by doing so, enable that individual to travel internationally, at least theoretically. So passports in this sense can connote nationality, but not necessarily. They don't necessarily connote nationality, just as nationality can connote citizenship, but not necessarily. So I view these terms as not interchangeable synonyms, but as distinct, though overlapping categories that can overlap, but that don't have to. So altogether, this conceptualization of citizenship aims to encompass legal and practice dimensions. And I think that this helps me to analyze residents with and without nationality and with and without passports, still within this overarching framework of citizenship, without sort of delimiting that relationship between a group and the state only to those who hold nationality. So taking a more expansive view in that regard. Okay, so kind of digging a little bit more into the paper. So the paper unpacks these points by focusing on two tensions in Gazan refugees' citizenship in Jordan. And this, I'll just quickly highlight, is coming from quite extensive primary source data that I've collected for my dissertation and is now for the book project, and I'll keep using for all kinds of different papers. And this includes many Jordanian laws, bylaws, and regulations, mostly accessed through online legal databases, personal interviews with about 150 different individuals between 2016 and 2019 in Jordan, including different ministers, bureaucrats, lawyers, activists, and refugees, among others, and also drawing from files from the US and British National Archives on Jordan's internal affairs. And these files are focusing particularly on the period between 1946 and 1973. So those are the different sources that I'm drawing from in this analysis. So at the heart of the paper now, the first tension that this paper explores is that Gazans have access to Jordanian passports, but not to Jordanian nationality. And at first it might seem obvious that, as a middle income refugee host state, Jordan has not offered a path for the Gazans to nationalize, but it's very important to point out that Jordan did provide such a path for the 1948 Palestinian refugees, and that was only months after issuing them Jordanian passports in 1949. And this path also, it's important to note, made the 1948 Palestinian refugees equal citizens essentially by descent and residence rather than by naturalization, and that has implications for sort of the political rights. So they're really being folded into the citizenry in a deep way, at least legally. But unlike the 1948 Palestinians, Jordan has only provided Gazans with temporary Jordanian passports that do not signify or confer nationality since 1968. So if we're thinking about the 1948 Palestinians, we can see that only months after getting access to passports, they get access to nationality, but we never see that with the Gazans. They get access to not passports, but temporary passports, and then never access to nationality. However, another dimension of this passport nationality tension is that Gazans have access to these passports based on implementing regulations that are not grounded in higher level legislation, specifically in laws. I don't have time to go into all the details now, though I'd be very happy to in the Q&A, but basically these passports do not exist in the nationality or passports laws, which is surprising because Jordan adopted a new passports law, as well as an amendment to the nationality law in 1969, so just a year after Jordan started issuing these passports to some Gazan refugees. And even today, the passports law remains silent about these temporary passports, despite undergoing amendments in 2013 and 2014. At the same time, the Civil Status and Passports Department includes specific application forms for the Gazan temporary passports on its website, and major news outlets report about changes to these passports, as both shown on this slide. This screenshot in Arabic is from the Civil Status and Passports Department website, and it provides details on how to apply for the first time for a temporary passport if you are a Gazan. Based on these and other examples, I argue that the absence of temporary passports in the passports law is notable and contrasts with their presence in practice, with their clear presence in practice, and that this adds to the Gazans' ambiguous, somewhat extra-legal citizenship in Jordan. Another point worth emphasizing here is that Gazan passports have at times given them access to the same rights as citizens. For example, in the 1970s, non-citizen Gazans holding a Jordanian temporary passport received the same treatment when, as citizen West Bankers who held full passports as Jordanian citizens when crossing between the West and East Banks. And this US archival file from 1972 makes this policy clear and explicit, with US Embassy staff in Amman noting that Gazans with temporary Jordanian passports will be accorded the same treatment as West Bankers. So overall, policies like this one, combined with the temporary and full Jordanian passports looking nearly identical on the outside, have helped to blur distinctions in some areas between non-citizen Gazans and Jordanian citizens. Though I want to emphasize that this point should not undermine any of the difficulties that Gazans face as non-citizens compared to Jordanians. There are certainly many areas where these distinctions are not blurred and are meaningful, as I'll talk about a bit in a moment. But the areas of blurred distinctions, though, do help explain a second tension that exists for Gazans between formal and informal citizen status. The paper highlights distinctions in Arabic between a broader notion of citizenship as muwatana and a stricter legal definition of nationality as jinsiyah. In Jordan, citizenship, or muwatana, describes the broad relationship between the state and its residents, while nationality, jinsiyah, refers to the narrow legal relationship that defines who has legal citizen status in that state. In my research, interviewees described muwatana as not only the rights and duties between individuals and the state, but also what it means to belong in that state. So really parsing apart these two aspects of citizenship. And in the brief time remaining, I'll just highlight two examples of this before concluding. So Gazan refugee descriptions of their relationship with Jordan contextualize how jinsiyah and muwatana do not necessarily align. As lifelong residents of Jordan, Gazan refugees can feel a sense of belonging and connection to Jordan, a form of muwatana, despite never having legal citizen status, despite never having jinsiyah. For example, one non-citizen development worker I spoke with, whose mother is Jordanian and whose father is a Gazan refugee, explained that to her, citizenship means growing up in Jordan. My mom is Jordanian and I am helping Jordan's development. I feel like a Jordanian citizen, even though I do not have a national number. Some situations make me remember that I am not a citizen, but I feel Jordanian. I feel muwatana, but I do not have jinsiyah. And that interview was in English, so she's pulling in those Arabic terms in this English description. This case highlights another important aspect of Jordanian citizenship, which I examine in other work, where Jordanian women, unlike Jordanian men, cannot pass their nationality on to their children. So similar to Gazan refugees, the children of Jordanian women and non-Jordanian men lack Jordanian nationality, despite often feeling like they are Jordanian. So in other words, both of these groups possess an informal practice citizen status despite not having a formal legal status. Again, nationality can connote citizenship, but not necessarily, and it's possible to have aspects of citizenship without having nationality. So really disaggregating these terms. And one last example before I conclude, if there's still time, if I'm not rushed out. The second example of this tension comes from in the remarks of an ex-Gazan refugee teacher who exclaimed, "Gazans are not asking for a national number, which conveys nationality in Jordan. We're just asking for human rights, education, work, and healthcare. Gazans pay taxes and do other duties." He then poignantly described an incident where he was humiliated on a public bus during a routine police check. During the check, the police officer aggressively pulled him off the bus and searched him in front of everyone due to his lack of nationality. He stated that it was so humiliating. These cards are humiliating, these identity cards that distinguish them as non-citizens. After 50 years in this country, his frustration and despair reflect his sense of injustice of being treated like an outsider despite being a nearly lifelong resident of Jordan. So overall, these discrepancies challenge that simple alignment of citizenship and nationality. And I think they blur the boundaries at times between citizens and non-citizens, as well as between citizens and refugees, particularly in contexts where ordinary naturalization is rare and beyond the reach of most non-citizen populations. So I think I've already really hammered it home that I want to distinguish between these concepts. And I think that it's interesting and important because by doing so, it can really highlight how specifically states can create ambiguous citizenship and what it can look like, how it can materialize and manifest by looking at these different nationality passports, policies, and these distinctions between legal and practiced forms of citizenship. So I'll stop there. I think I'm a little over time. I apologize, but thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lillian. You are a little bit over time, but we will forgive you on the grounds of a wonderful presentation. So thank you so much. What an amazing panel. Wow, so much to reflect on, so many thoughts, so many ideas. Yeah, I've really enjoyed 4 wonderful presentations. So first of all, thank you. And second, let's have some questions and Q&A. There are a couple that have already come in. If I can ask you all to perhaps put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat, just so we don't have to keep track of lots of different screens. There is a question to Mohammed from M. Monsef Khadar. To what extent, regardless of the difference between theory and practice of citizenship-citizenry under populist authoritarianism and later under post-autocratic 2010, impoverished and disempowered ordinary citizens remain manipulated by and victim of both dominant political, social, and cultural orders. The full question is written out in the chat. So that's one question to Mohammed. And I'll add a second question to Mohammed from Jacob Eriksson, who says, thanks. And there's long been talk of reforming Tunisian democracy to empower the politically and economically marginalized populations of the country's interior. Would this lead to more meaningful citizenship or simply continue to protect coastal elite control? So Mohammed, perhaps if you can address those first, and then we will take more questions after this.
Thank you, Simon. I'd like to thank both Mr. Monsef and Mr. Jacob for these very interesting questions, and they are very relevant to this current situation in Tunisia, actually. Well, regarding the first question, I'll say that to a large extent, meaning if we speak about the manipulation of the impoverished masses, I say to you, yes, monopolization, the manipulation is there, and that's the consequence of the polarization which is happening on the Tunisian scene. And it's also the consequence of the shifting of the focus from the social and the civil and the political, meaning rights, meaning to identity. But still, there is hope. I think Qais Said managed to a certain extent to put an end to investment in identity issues. For example, Nahda Party and they tend to invest into questions of the Arab-Muslim identity. So Said managed to a certain extent to put an end to that. And still, as I said to you, so this is a source of hope. The other thing is that there are regions and like the mining basin, for example, and there are also social categories, especially among the followers of Qais Said, meaning generally the youth. They are the ones who are not, they are people not interested in this controversy, meaning, and they are fed up with it. And I think this represents a departure from that old order which dominated the scene in Tunisia after 2011. So again, thank you very much, Mr. Munsaf, for this question. Now, regarding Jacob's question, here Jacob says that Qais Said has long spoken of reforming the Tunisian democracy and to give voice to the political and economically marginalized population of the country. Would this lead to more meaningful citizenship or simply continue to protect the coastal elite? Now, fortunately, Said doesn't belong to the coastal elite, and he doesn't belong also to the Bildiya elite. The Bildiya are the people from the capital, and traditionally in Tunisia, meaning presidents are either from, and prime ministers are either from the coast or Bildiya, meaning Bourguiba, for example, Ben Ali, etc. They are from the coast, and we have Marzouki for a short period, and then now Qais Said. It doesn't belong to that I'll say to that urban elite, meaning those, or to the coastal elite. So this is a change in Tunisian history. However, the problem with Said is with the how, meaning will we have a meaningful citizenship under Said? The question is how to do it. And that's why Said has been accused several times of being a populist. Actually, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, I was listening to Said speaking about the mafia, the thieves, the traitors, etc. But the problem is how to put an end to that old system, or what the Tunisians refer to as le système. Now, this is the major question. Said has good intentions, but the problem is how the mechanism, how to change, meaning citizenship, the current, I'll say, futile citizenship regime into what Keith Fox referred to as a deep or thick citizenship regime. So so far we haven't seen any good symptoms, meaning it's just at the level of rhetoric, meaning he hasn't gone further. So he's still accusing them of being thieves. People are listening to him, and now that identity polarization, meaning has changed a bit, meaning it's not about the Arab Muslim identity, it's not about the Bourguibis and the non-Bourguibis, but it's more about the followers of Qais Said who think that there is a mafia dominating the country, and they want to put an end to it. And there are others who have been investing in that polarization, meaning identity polarization, and they are, meaning for them that's how shall I call it? Meaning that's their only, meaning they nourish on that, so they don't want that polarization to come to an end. So this is regarding the question of Mr. Jacob, and to be honest with you, I'm not that hopeful, because even the Qais Said is not, so far, at least in these 3 months or 4 months, we haven't seen much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Okay, we've had a couple more questions come in. There's one from Thomas McGee. Thanks for your paper earlier, Thomas. Fascinating stuff. He would like to ask Lillian if she could expand on the concepts of time that doesn't count with regard to qualification for naturalization / legal inclusion. How is this extra legal exceptionalization for the case of the Gazans justified in the Jordanian discourse beyond the right to return argument? I would also like to add in to Noor. Really enjoyed the presentation and enjoyed all of them. 2 points. I wonder about the tribal dimension. Where does tribalism fit into all of this? And I alluded to it after your presentation, but I wonder about this individual collective sort of tension or interplay. I say this having contributed to a report on ways to try and address sect-based violence in the goodness, it would be 2017 now. And one of the findings was to say, look, we need to advocate for this move towards recognition of individual rights over collective communal rights as a means of trying to sort of break communal dominance. And that was obviously in different contexts. We were looking at Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that in the Jordanian context. And Lillian may have some thoughts on that as well. In fact, Abbas might have some thoughts on that as well. So perhaps if we can take Thomas's question and then my rambling something or other. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the question, Thomas. Thomas has recently read an extremely long report that I wrote on citizenship in Jordan. So he's a very patient and appreciated person. But so for this question, it's a good question. And I think that this ideas related to the right of return are the most dominant when it comes to the discourse of why Gazans aren't able to access naturalization, which actually, if we look legally, there are 3 different routes to naturalization that they could access based on Jordanian nationality law. But in practice, it's really not a possibility. And I think more so than the right of return, because remember, in the Jordanian context, there are many Palestinian Jordanians, and they have not given up their right of return. So I think with the Gazans, it's a bit more about tawfin and the idea of resettling them instead of sending them back to Palestine, in the future when there's a Palestinian state, combined with the concern that I heard many officials reference, and we can challenge, how much we think that this is really a concern to these officials or not. But what they'll say, if we're talking about discourse, is about emptying Palestine, because almost like it's a domino effect. As soon as Jordan starts to nationalize more Palestinians, then all, Palestinians are just going to flock to Jordan, and it will be al-Watan al-Badil, and it will be Jordan becomes Palestine and Jordan as the alternative homeland. So I think that's really the main discourse that Jordanian officials advance in terms of kind of defending why Gazans don't have access to naturalization, even though by law they should, by far. Whether they applied as an Arab, as a non-Arab, as an expatriate is another category that applies to Palestinians. At least it has in the past. So I think that's really the main aspect to it. But yeah, so I hope that answers the question. And I think I'll let Noor answer Simon's question first, and then if there's anything I have to tack onto that, I'll pick it up there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lillian, by the way. It's also my pleasure to meet you, at least virtually. I mean, it's very, very nice, to meet people, scholars studying the same topic. And Simon, thank you very much for your actually challenging question. It's a very good question, because it also shows what's actually changing in the country, because Lillian also mentioned to some extent in defining who is a Jordanian historically with the end of the Arab-Israeli war. And I can also now give a live answer to Professor Monsef's question regarding using Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli. Yes, it's definitely an academic probably version time to time that we use it, but of course we should not consider that the very fact that this is one of the key, probably the key problem of the region. I mean, maybe with the Arab Spring and what's going on in Syria, or the instabilities in Iraq, time to time can change, you know, what is the main agenda for the Middle East politics. But I can definitely, I mean, would like to specify that without finding a solution to this problem and the future of, for instance, East Jerusalem or West Bank, and also as Lillian also mentioned, the status of the territories such as Gaza, this would really create not just problems for the Jordanians, but the Palestinians, first of all. I mean, this is a real fact. So the Jordanian citizenship and the nation formation actually from the beginning based on the Bedouins, because the kingdom took its, you know, it's the backbone is basically the main source of the legitimacy is the tribes, basically the East Bank tribes or the Bedouins, as we can say. So who were the Bedouins? Actually, they were diverse, but I mean, those people that there are not also the Palestinians, because the Palestinians were more urbanized, they were more educated when they also migrated to Jordan right after the first Arab-Israeli war. And it is also very, I think, important to state that when I conducted interviews in different times when I visited Jordan, what people are telling to me, not just the political elites, but also the people on the street, that the regime has always been very tolerant for this diversity actually in the country. But one of the main things that they may not maybe negotiate is, of course, the survival of the kingdom. And with the disengagement from the West Bank, the electoral law issue, which was amended in 1993, that has to become known as a controversial electoral law. Why I mention that? Because tribalism started, or the kingdom's relationship with the East Bankers started to be actually very, very important because of establishing that loyalty to the kingdom, particularly after 1970s and onwards. And that was the main reason that I wanted to highlight, because this is something, as I can observe with some other, I mean, scholars such as Curtis Ryan, Gillian Schwedler, who also, I mean, studies particularly on the subject, that the East Bankers is actually becoming already actually became an opposition, but to what extent, what they were going to demand, because this is what they are demanding, is actually passing the threshold of being being loyal to the kingdom. I'm not just telling to the king himself, because it is still actually something in progress, but it seems like that this is something newly grown in country's history, that the tribes that the country actually, the kingdom acquired its main legitimacy, is now started to be questioned. But the division among the East Bankers is something like a safety valve, maybe for the moment. So this is what I can say, that this tribalism issue has been the main source of survival or the legitimacy, but now it is something that is trying to ask for a real, genuine reform.
I'm not sure if I got your question right this time, but the issue of citizenship in Lebanon, I think it's a bit different from the case of Jordan. We don't have a problem of inclusion and exclusion, who is a Lebanese and who is not, because in Lebanon, we usually don't give, or the Lebanese government doesn't grant citizenship to foreigners. That's a real issue. But we have another issue, which is related somehow to it, is the issue of the Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And a few days ago, the Minister of Labor issued a new decree allowing the Palestinians to join the syndics in Lebanon and to work. This actually ignited a huge debate in Lebanon, especially the Christians rejected his decision and considered it as a step toward naturalizing and granting citizenship to the Palestinians in Lebanon. And this actually raised an issue which actually exists since the formation of the Lebanese state about the social cohesion of the Lebanese society and its ability to accept and to naturalize foreign citizens. And that would the Christians, for instance, and the Druze are afraid about the change in the balance of, or the change in the size of the demographic sizes of the Syrian communities. The Christians are becoming a minority in Lebanon, and they are afraid about their status, social, political, and economic status in the state institutions, and their ability to influence the to have a large parliamentary bloc, large share in the parliament, in the government, and to influence the domestic politics. But the minister who took the decision was a Shia minister close to Hezbollah, and he considered as a right for the Palestinians to work in Lebanon. So since they are settling in Lebanon, the Christians consider it as a step toward naturalizing the Palestinians, and that's what affect the balance, demographic balance in Lebanon. I think that's refers also to the implications of this civil war, which I discussed before, about the trust between the Syrian communities and their ability to bridge the gap between the Muslims and the Christians. And now we have the dominant groups, the Christians, Sunnis, and Shiites. We used to talk about Christians and Muslims. Now we have Christians, Sunnis, and Shiites, and each community is trying to change the balance of the demography and the political process in the country to meet its interests. And I think the Minister of Labor took this decision for two main reasons. Because of humanitarian reason, because these Palestinians are not allowed to own in Lebanon, to buy and sell, to buy homes and to have their own homes. They are still living in refugee camps. And for political reasons, he took this decision, trying, I think, before the elections in March or May next year. By taking this decision, he will be able to attract followers and convince followers from Sunni community, especially the Sunni community now is dismantled because of the absence of the main Sunni leader, Saad Hariri, and he's now settling in United Arab Emirates, and he is suffering from financial problems and the inability of his party, the Future Movement, to organize itself around of the next elections. So this debate exists in Lebanon, but it has its own process, which is different from the case of Jordan that they both discussed, Lilian and Noor, in their discussions and their presentations. It's very hard to get this citizenship in Lebanon. But the issue of the Syrians and the Palestinians is a major case and major source of fear for the minorities in Lebanon, especially for the Christians. Hopefully at this point answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Abbas. That's really interesting, really useful, and certainly offers some useful comparisons and interesting comparisons with the Jordanian and Tunisian cases. Lilian, I wonder if you have anything that you'd like to add to Noor's answer, and then I fear we're probably out of time. So this is you having the last word.
Oh, wow, what an honor.
No pressure.
I think something that came up in Noor's presentation as well is in my mind is about this distinction between kind of more of a Hashemite Jordanian identity and this more a Transjordanian East Bank identity that's been in tension, and I think that we're seeing particularly dominant today, though Gillian Schwedler's new book shows the long history of East Bank protests in Jordan, even kind of predating the independence of the state. So that narrative she's challenging a little bit, and I'm only challenging it because I recently read her book, read the manuscript. But I think this tension between kind of that Hashemite Jordanian identity and more of a nativist, for lack of a better word, kind of East Bank Transjordanian identity is coming across today, and you see that in rhetoric against the Queen, especially among some of these some East Bank tribal groups, some retired military servicemen who kind of organize different small WhatsApp groups and ways of kind of exerting their displeasure with the Queen and with any kind of Jordanian identity that might include Palestinian Jordanians. So I think that there is really this tension. And as Noor pointed out, the Hashemites themselves not being, from the East Bank, I think plays into sort of some of the specificities in the Jordanian case, where they're kind of trying to have sort of this mediator role, but now some East Bankers are kind of calling that into question in a way that might challenge the monarchy, which we know has always been a major red line, and we're seeing that protests are getting ever closer to it. So I think unpacking a bit more of that tension as well, kind of within the East Bank, and not only thinking Palestinian Jordanian or Palestinian versus Transjordanian, but also thinking about how can Hashemite ideas of Jordanianness play into these protests and these ongoing debates about who is Jordanian. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Abbas. Thank you, Mohammed. And thank you, everyone, for a really interesting panel. Great questions, lots to reflect on, lots to think about moving forwards. So, yeah, a huge thank you. We really enjoyed that. And we have one final session coming up shortly, but there's time for coffee, much needed coffee before getting there. So, join us again in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.